Okay, let's talk about the TOEFL Task 2 essay. So most of the videos on my channel deal with the GRE, but that doesn't mean it's the only test that I am familiar with or the only test that I like to talk about. I also have a lot of experience with something called the TOEFL test. If you're not familiar with this test, it's an assessment that international students or people who want to prove their English ability take primarily to gain acceptance to an American university or other programs around the world. And the test consists of four parts. It has a reading part, a listening part, a speaking part, and a writing part, which is the last part. And the writing section is actually divided into two essays. One of the essays is called the Task 1 essay, and another essay is called the Task 2 essay. This video is going to be about the latter, the Task 2 essay, and I'm going to give you my experience and kind of my knowledge that I have about this, and show you that it's really not something that should scare you too much or intimidate you. It's really not that challenging as long as you go in with a plan. Now, if you look on the left here, I have some questions that I'm often asked by students about the Task 2 essay, and then on the right, I have an actual TOEFL prompt, Task 2 prompt that we will write the essay together with. So anyway, let's just begin with number one. Number one says, how formulaic are TOEFL essays? In other words, can I just follow an essay recipe? And the answer here is basically yes, 100% yes, 1000% yes. You can follow a TOEFL recipe, template, or structure, however you want to discuss it. I will go over shortly what my TOEFL structure is, and again, not really mine for me as a native speaker, but the TOEFL template that I teach to a lot of my international students. So the writing I'm doing today is not going to be as complex or as detailed as what you might see on the GRE, but it doesn't need to be, and you can still get a high score on the TOEFL test. But bottom line, yes, you can write a very structured, formulaic TOEFL essay and get a high score. All right, number two says, how are these essays scored? Well, these essays, that includes Task 1 and Task 2, are scored on a scale of 1 to 5. And they're scored by two different entities. One human, and what ETS calls its E-grader, or something like that. Basically, the E-grader is a computer that analyzes grammatical structures, transition words, paragraph organization, things of that nature, and gives it a score on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, if the grader and the E-grader, the HAL 2000, or is it the HAL 1000, disagree by more than a point or something like that, then the essay is sent to another human being for an additional rating. So at the end of this, you're going to have 4 scores. So you will have 4 scores, 2 for each essay. These scores are then averaged together, and finally, your basically averaged score is converted to a scaled score on from 1 to 30. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you get a 4.0 on Task 1 from the human, 4.0 on Task 1 from the computer, let's say 3.0 on Task 2 from the human, and 4.0 on Task 2 from the computer, your average is going to be 3.75. And that translates roughly to about a 22, maybe a 23 on TOEFL's writing scaled score system. So basically that's how the scoring works. It's not overly complicated. And you can see ETS is trying to save money by having this computer grader come into the mix. But it is pretty reliable. People who do well on these essays tend to have good grammar, good paragraph organization, things of that nature. So in most cases, the computer is sufficient, operating as the second grader. Question number three. Question number three states, do I have to tell the truth? Do my examples have to be persuasive? And the answer is no, they don't. Or no, you don't. Basically, this is not a GRE essay where you're trying to convince people and put forth very clear, cogent arguments. All you're really trying to do with this essay is show your writing ability, right? So the main point of this essay is to demonstrate that you know how to write academically in the English language. That's it. Right? If you put some ridiculous example that's obviously not true, and you do it with good grammar and you do it with good structure and things of that nature, you should be okay. Now, I still encourage you to tell the truth. First of all, it's good practice for the future. Second of all, sometimes when I create these ridiculous lies in my essay, it kind of throws me off my game a little bit. And then I end up maybe, feeling a little bit not in the zone, or I feel like my argument is not very good, which causes some of my writing ability to go down. So I still encourage you to tell the truth if possible, but saying a lie is much better than sitting there doing nothing. So lie if you have to. Number 4, can I give personal examples? Sure. Why not? Right. This is another thing that I discourage on other tests like the GRE. But on the TOEFL, again, if you give a personal example with good writing, good grammar, good syntax, you're going to be just fine. It's not a big deal. All right. Finally, number 5, what exactly are the graders looking for? Well, we can divide it into several components here. So number 1, as much as they tell you that they're looking for good grammar, good spelling, and good punctuation. It doesn't matter how good your ideas are, how good your organization is. You're not going to get a high score if you have a lot of grammar mistakes, a lot of spelling mistakes, you don't know how to use commas, you don't know how to use periods or semicolons. Number 2, they're looking for essay organization, which, again, let's simplify this. This means 4 to 5 paragraphs. You have an introduction, you have 2 or 3 body paragraphs, you have a conclusion. Number 3, they're looking for specific reasons and examples that support your thesis statement. Now, these must be clear. The parts of your essay that they ask for must be clear. So your thesis must be clear, the reasons you provide must be clear, the examples you provide must be clear, and they must support each other, even if it's a lie. Remember, I said you can lie, but that still means your lie must support the reason. Here's some problems a lot of students make. One problem is they give reasons and or examples that don't support the thesis. They're kind of off topic, or they don't really address what the writer's arguing. Another big mistake that I often see is they give reasons that are the same. So they give like 2 reasons or 3 reasons, but in reality, it's the same reason every time. So you really have to be careful here, because the TOEFL is specifically asking you, if you look on the right here, they're specifically asking you to use specific reasons and examples to support your answer. And if you have trouble with this, they are going to lower your score. And basically, that's it, guys. I mean, they are looking for you to meet the word limit. So TOEFL recommends 300 plus words. That's what they recommend. They are looking for you to finish the task in the time limit. So for this, they give you 30 minutes. In fact, the computer will shut down, so there's really nothing you can do to extend this. And if you have all of these things under control, there's no reason why you shouldn't get a high score. So with that in mind, let's move on to the structure that you can use to write the TOEFL essay. The structure is relatively simple. It's not going to knock anybody's socks off, but if you follow it to a T and you don't make a lot of grammar mistakes, you should do pretty well. So on the left, you can now see the structure that I often suggest to my students. And of course, this is not the structure you always have to follow, and you can get a high score or a perfect score by following a different structure. But there is some benefit to memorizing this or memorizing something very similar, because whenever you get a passage, you don't just want to be sitting there staring at the screen blankly. Nothing kills a score faster than doing that. So in the introduction, you can just start a sentence with saying something like, some people or some experts or some researchers, and then say something good about the side you disagree with. So let's say, for example, I think bananas are delicious. So I would start by saying, some people claim that bananas are not delicious because of blah, 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 blah. After I do that, I'm then going to have a sentence that says, however, and then I'm going to state my thesis, which is by far the most important part of your essay. It's your opinion. And with the TOEFL, you don't really want to take a middle opinion. You definitely just want to take a strong, agree or strong disagree, because it just makes it so much easier. And then finally, you're just going to provide an outline that tells the reader how many body paragraphs you have and what they'll be about. So let's go ahead and do this over here. Take a look at this prompt. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Movies and television have more negative effects than positive effects on the way young people behave. So let's take, for example, that I disagree with this. Let me make this bigger. Oops. All right, let me make this a little bigger. So let's say I disagree. I think that movies and television are actually more beneficial for young people than, basically right there, okay? So how would I start this introduction? I would just start by saying the opposite. I would say, some people argue that movies, television, and other media have significant drawbacks on how young people behave. They cite the violence and overly sexual nature of these media to support their point. That's it. Now, I did 2 sentences, but you don't have to do 2. You can just do 1. This accomplishes 2 things. Number 1, it shows the grader that you're aware of both sides. You're not biased, you're not prejudiced, or at least you're knowledgeable of both sides. And number 2, it just gets you writing immediately. You're not sitting there wasting time or thinking about a really clever hook, like a quote or anything like that. It just gets you into it immediately. So let's go ahead and use some color. So let's make this this blue here, and I'll make it over here the same color blue. All right. So now let's do the thesis in red, because it's the most important thing. All right, put that in red, and here we go. Oops, that's not red. So you would say, however, I strongly disagree with these people and believe that movies and television provide far more advantages for young people. Okay, so that's my thesis. It's very important. That's why it's in red. And it's actually not that long. The most important part is I strongly disagree right there. Okay? Now let's do the outline. The outline is when I tell the reader how many body paragraphs I have, and depending on time or depending on space, I even tell him exactly what I'm going to write about. But you don't have to. You can just say reasons if you want to. So let's make this into, how about green? All right, we're into the green. Okay. I will support my viewpoint with 3 reasons. That's it. That's the introduction. And if you memorize this structure, you should be able to do it in about 2 or 3 minutes. The only thing you really need to come up with is your thesis, how many reasons you're going to do, and maybe 1 or 2 supporting points of the other side. But really, if you move, this doesn't take very long, and you can have a very solid introduction in less than 3 or 4 minutes. So let's move on to one of our body paragraphs and let's look at the structure. So we're going to start with a topic sentence with a reason that supports my thesis. Now, remember, my thesis is I think television and movies have a positive effect on the way young people behave. So I need to come up with a reason for that. So one reason that I could say, and let's go back to black. One reason I could say is I would say, first of all, movies and television positively impact the actions of young children because many of these films have or deliver positive messages to the audience. Something like that. Right? And now I need to come up with an example to support that. So try to think of a movie or a show that kind of has a positive message about the way children should behave. So I'll say something like this. For example, it is common now for television shows to demonstrate that bullying is not the correct course of action for children at school. Something like that. And let's get to some colors here so we can figure out what's going on. So let's make the topic sentence into blue again. Okay. Oops. 1 second. All right. So topic sentence is going to be blue. Well, I should make all of it blue, right? And then this is going to be blue as well. So as you can see, the topic sentence is really, the job of it is, to say, first of all, to tell the reader this is your first paragraph, but also to give your first supporting point. And my first supporting point is about these positive messages. Then let's get into the example. And the example we'll make into the color, we'll just follow the same structure as the organization, red. So here's my example. Let's make it red. And then my example here is just about bullying. Bullying, you shouldn't be a bully. Bullying's bad. I could give another example about don't do drugs or treat people with respect or something like that. Now, here's where you get into a very cool thing called the negative example. In the negative example, you present a situation where without movies and television, these positive messages cannot be delivered. So I would say something like this. I would say, in the past, before these media were available, children would not have been able to learn about the negative effects of bullying and other bad behaviors, and thus they participated in them at a higher, or let's say more frequently. Okay, and let me come down a little bit. So what you have here is actually what I call the double example. You give an example that really supports your point, and then you take away, in this case, the movies and the television. You take that away, and then you get into what's called the negative example. And the negative example is just really hammering home the point that without the movies and the television, you're going to have bad effects, and actually it's having a positive effect on young children's behavior. And then finally, the last part of this body paragraph is what's called the analysis or the development, or basically, why is this important? Many people neglect this part of the essay, which is a shame. You should not neglect this part of the essay. That's a bad thing. And what it does is you have to explain why your reason connects to your thesis. So when you say you disagree that media and television are actually good for children, and then you give the reason about positive messages, well, you actually have to explain why do the positive messages, or why are the positive messages important, or why does that influence your opinion? Why should I even care that these movies and these shows have positive messages? Now, one mistake that people always make, or not always, but frequently, is they continue to write about the example. They finish their paragraph with the example. No, your example's over. It's finished. Don't write about the example anymore. You need to explain about the reason, and the reason is positive messages, right? So I would say something like this. Let's use a different color. Let's go ahead and use purple. So here comes the purple part. So I would say it is important for children to be exposed to these positive messages because they are highly, I don't want to use too complex vocabulary in a TOEFL essay, because they are able to be influenced at such a young age. Their brains are still developing, and it is important that they see positive reinforcement of good behaviors as often as possible. And then finally, you can put a little concluding sentence, but it's not necessary. You would say something like, thus, media and TV are actually beneficial for children. Something like that. So that's how I do a body paragraph. So let's do a recap. You come up here with the topic sentence, and the topic sentence's job is to deliver the reason, the supporting point. You then get into the example that directly supports positive message. You then get into what I call the negative example. Take away the TV and the movies, and it still supports your point. And then finally, why is this important? You need to explain why it's important. In this case, I said, their brains are developing, they're able to be influenced, and they should be exposed to positive messages as often as possible. And that's how I write the body paragraph. Now let's do a word count. Right now, just for this paragraph, I have 130 words, which is very long. So in fact, if this was a real TOEFL essay, I would come back up to my thesis and I would change this 3 to the number 2. And this means I don't have to come up with a third reason. I just have to come up with one more reason. And I'm going to follow this exact same structure. I'm not going to write it, but I'll write the transition word. So what I'm going to do, I said first of all up here, I'm going to say second of all, and then I'm going to restate my thesis or rephrase my thesis, and then say because, and then supporting point number 2. I'm then going to go into my example with, for instance. So it's going to be green. I'm going to say for instance, and then I'm going to provide an example that supports this reason. I'm then going to go to red. Okay, and I'm going to say provide a negative example that really emphasizes the importance of this reason. And then finally, in the color purple, I'm just going to explain why this is important. So this is important because, and then explain why it's important. Remember, I'm not going to talk about my example here. My example is finished, okay? And so once I do that, I can then finally move to my conclusion. And in my conclusion, if you look at the structure, you're just going to state that it is a complex issue with people on both sides. And this is relatively easy to do. So let's go to black. You're just going to say, to conclude, or in conclusion, or to sum up, something like that. The issue of whether children should be able to watch significant amounts of television and movies is complex. Some have suggested that their viewing times be reduced because the media negatively influences their behavior. So again, I'm just saying it's a complex issue. I'm kind of giving a little bit of kind of acknowledgement to the other side, but I'm just going to rephrase my thesis and my supporting reasons. And I'm just going to say, nevertheless, I still contend that TV and movies are advantageous for children, and that they have a mostly, or let's say wholly, let's say encouraging effect on their behavior. And that's it. So really, the TOEFL essay is not nearly as complex as the GRE essay. I mean, not even close. This is a relatively simplistic approach, but here's the thing. I don't have grammar mistakes. I don't have a lot of redundancy. I use some pretty advanced sentence structure. I have very good paragraph structure. My examples support my reasons. My negative example supports my reasons. I have analysis, which kind of develops it, which bridges my reason to my thesis. I acknowledge the other side, and I did all of this under the time limit, which is going to be 30 minutes. And then let's look at the word count. So the word count of this right here is going to be 300 words, which is about what I want to do. But notice I didn't even fully finish this second paragraph. So in reality, we're probably looking at about 350 to 400 words once I fully flesh out my body paragraph 2. Now, another thing you can do is you can make these body paragraphs a little bit shorter. Take out the negative example or take out some of the analysis. But if you do that, don't forget, you need to come up here and change this to the number 3, because you probably are going to need 3 body paragraphs. So anyway, that's how I do it, guys. That's how I do a TOEFL essay. That's how I teach it, at least. As a native English speaker, I, of course, have a lot more flexibility in how I approach this. I could maybe do a 500 or 600 word essay if I were so inclined. I could use very complex vocabulary or maybe even take a middle approach. But if you're an international student who's just trying to get the TOEFL out of the way, you should follow a relatively simplistic template structure and focus on just having good grammar, good punctuation, good syntax. Make sure your reasons support your thesis. Make sure your examples support your reasons. Make sure you have some analysis. Put it all together in a 4 to 5 paragraph bow, and you are good to go. And I can't imagine why you wouldn't get a 4.0 from both the computer and the grader. 4.0 minimum. I had a student who followed this approach, took it very systematically, and I think she ended up with like a 27 or a 28 out of 30 on the TOEFL. But keep in mind, she didn't make a lot of grammar mistakes. So really, probably what's holding back your score, at least a big part of it, is you're just producing writing that is chock full of grammar mistakes and things of that nature. Anyway, this is my first TOEFL video. I love the TOEFL. TOEFL's good. Like I said, most of my videos are about the GRE, but the TOEFL's also an interesting test. They're from the same company. I know a lot about them. And if you guys have any questions, you can shoot me an email at gregmattesting@gmail.com. I hope this was helpful, and I will hopefully make more TOEFL videos in the future. Have a good day.